Hey guys, it's Big E from Big E Mini C, and this is the comprehensive guide to Korean film of the past 15 years. Alright guys, it is summer in America. I'm getting ready to go to Korea, and I realized that I need to catch up on some Korean films. So I went back and did some research on some of the films that I've seen and some of the films that I want to see. What I realized is I have missed out on so much Korean cinema. And the reason is when I first started watching Korean films about 2010, there were some good films. But since that time, Korean cinema seems to have taken off, both in popularity domestically and internationally. So there are so many films I need to see. So I'm going to focus this list on people who, much like myself, might be interested in learning about Korean culture through watching Korean cinema. So for that, let's get started. I've split this up into 6 categories: artsy, modern Korean history, ancient Korean history, horror, action and comedy, and fantasy action. Category 1, artsy films. I start with artsy films because there's one film that every person interested in Korea should watch, and that film is Oldboy. Oldboy is probably the representative Korean film. This is a tale of Korean vengeance, of revenge, of what happens when the soul is hurt. If you're also interested, look up the Korean emotion Han. It's a whole can of worms there. I have no idea how to explain it. Maybe Mini C can explain later. What's Han, Mini? As expected, Han is not something that we can explain in a very short time. So we're gonna move on.
Okay, I'm gonna read it. Han has a very complex meaning, so when translating a word, the context in which Han is mentioned is important, being that there's really no definition for it.
That's even longer.
Sorrow, regret, grief, resentment, a dull ache.
Sorrow, regret, grief, resentment, and a dull ache of the soul. Sounds like what I eat for breakfast every day. So Oldboy you have to watch. Spike Lee redid this in 2013, and it's just not great. The same director just came out with a movie 2 years ago, and I think it's one of the best Korean movies I've ever seen. It's called The Handmaiden. It's about a Korean handmaiden to a rich Japanese woman, and you just have to watch it. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. Second category, modern Korean history. Now, the reason that I mentioned modern Korean history before we go into some of the more interesting films like action and comedy is because if you're moving to South Korea or you're interested in the culture, modern Korean history from World War II onward has a significant continuing effect on Korean identity and culture. So I think it's very important to understand aspects of the Korean War. After the Korean War, that South Korea was part of a dictatorship until 1988. So I've actually split this up into 2 separate categories: Korean War to 1980 and then post-1980. These videos are about Korean War up to 1980. The first one is Ode to My Father, or the Korean name Gukjae Sijang. And this is a real tearjerker. This is one that I watched on an airplane, and it's really not a good idea to cry on an airplane, but the nice thing is no one really cares because they're all asleep. This is the 3rd highest grossing movie in Korean history, and I mentioned this one first because this gives the history of South Korea from 1950 to present day through the life of one man, and it talks about his journey through the Korean War and after. It's an absolute must-see.
Can I add up?
Quickly.
Okay, quickly. Okay, I'm gonna say it. Okay, word for it. Don't look at me like that. Okay. 국제시장 can shed a light of the gaps between older generation and new generation.
Oh, that's good.
I understand that. I don't think I'm conservative. Maybe I'm too.
You're not conservative.
I know.
You're pretty progressive.
Yeah, even in the
She
United
married me.
yeah, but
I wouldn't even do that.
what kind of social context, what kind of history formed those people that way?
So when you're getting on the subway and the old lady elbows you to get to the front of the line and doesn't even look at you or say sorry, just pushes you out of the way, watch this movie so you have a little more empathy for them. I do my elbows. They're sharp. Okay, the next movie is Taegukgi, Brotherhood of War. Taegukgi, hui 날리며.
Bam bam.
Bam bam. This has a history in the Big E Mini C family. This is about 2 brothers who end up fighting each other in the Korean War. And that's about all I need to say. It's a good movie. Dun dun! Next up is Silmido. Silmido is a film that we also showed it when Mini C and I taught a high school class on Korean history and culture.
We taught American students about Korean language and history.
I taught Korean language. stage. Okay, so in the early 1970s, there was a North Korean special unit that was sent to assassinate the South Korean president, and that failed. So the South Korean president, in secret, created a special forces group that was going to retaliate and do the same thing for North Korea. This is based on a true story. And so the island, do is the word for island, the island of Silmido, is where these people trained. They were prepared to go to North Korea and kill Kim Il-sung. This is the story of that group and what happened when political situations changed in South Korea. Okay, now let's move on to 1980s to present day history. I mentioned this next one first because it's the only non-political one on the movie list, and also this is a director that you should know. Memories of Murder was released in 2003. It's not a new movie. In Korean, it's called Sadin의 Chuok, and it's by the director Bong Joon-ho. Bong Joon-ho is recognized as number 13 of the top movie directors of the 21st century. He's directed several top Korean films that we're not going to mention in depth here. Those are Barking Dogs Never Bite. He also directed The Host, which is a South Korean, like, Jaws, Godzilla. It's a monster movie. He's also directed a few recent foreign films, the most prominent of which is Snowpiercer, which was released, I think, 2013. Memories of Murder is about the world of serial killers. Random serial killers are incredibly rare in South Korea, and this is a story of one of those that happened in 1986. It's a must-see. The next 4 movies is about a time in Korean history that I find the most fascinating. This is the 1980s, and the president at the time was Chun Doo-hwan, and you might consider him the last South Korean dictator. In 1988 was when South Korea became a democracy for the first time. And between 1980 and 1987 was these rumblings of democracy, there were uprisings, and there were all of these political changes happening. And the government at that time was very harsh. A lot of Korean directors have used this time period to create some really great movies. This movie we just watched a few weeks ago on the airplane over, and again, it's a tearjerker. What is it about jet lag and airplanes that makes tears easier to come to your eyes? This movie is 1987, When the Day Comes. This is based on the time in South Korea when the anti-communist movement was a great cover for suppression of all sorts of political dissidents and political adversaries. A student died during an interrogation, and this led, through many years, to what's known as the June Democratic Uprising. And it's a great story of Korean people's protest-based change that you actually saw as recently as last year when Park Geun-hye was kicked out of office due to protest. The next movie is a 2013 movie called The Attorney. In Korean, it's called Pyonho-in, and this is on my to-watch list this summer. It's about the Burin case, which is another example of Chun Doo-hwan and his oppression, and a lawyer and his team who ported them against the government. Now, the fascinating thing about this movie is the main lawyer was No Moo-hyun, who was later a South Korean president. He's also the only Korean president to commit suicide. It's a very sad case, worth reading up on. He was a real democratic people's president. Also on his team of lawyers is none other than Moon Jae-in, who is the current South Korean president. So this is a story of the current South Korean president working with a previous South Korean president to stand up against even a more previous South Korean dictator. The next 2 movies are about a sad event in South Korean history called the Gwangju Uprising, or the Gwangju Democratic Movement, or what is sometimes referred to as the Gwangju Massacre. And really what this was is a Tiananmen Square style massacre of the South Korean government against its own people in the city of Gwangju in South Korea. It happened in 1980, which is very recently, and it was covered up by the South Korean officials until much, much later. So the 2 movies that I recommend is one in 2007 called May 18. The Korean name is Hwaryohan Hyuga. And the next one is one last year, 2017, called A Taxi Driver. And this is a very popular movie. Right now, A Taxi Driver is the 11th biggest seller in South Korean movie history. And it's about a taxi driver who inadvertently goes to the city of Gwangju and becomes involved in this protest. Hey guys, Big E here reporting from our Tallahassee editing studio, editing in my pajamas. I just realized this video got way too long. So hop over to part 2 to learn about videos in the horror category, in the fantasy category, in the action category, and ancient Korean history. It's a lot of awesome stuff. Hop on over, watch part 2. You won't regret it. Peace out.